Last video, I showed you how to make 5 different beginner-friendly bracelets that anyone can follow. With the same type of knots, we're going to try and recreate this macrame that I found on Pinterest. If you look at the reference picture, we can see that the majority of this macrame piece is made of square knots that we learned in the last video. So recreating this piece should be a piece of cake for us. For materials, I'll be using embroidery thread for my macrame. Macrame is usually done in macrame cord, making it thicker, heavier, and also bigger. My piece will be a mini version of the real one since I'm only using embroidery thread. And the embroidery thread I'm using is from AliExpress. Its quality is not bad, and I like that it comes with a huge selection of colors, so I can find exactly the color that I'm looking for. I'm using black for my base strings, and I'll be adding the colored thread on top of the piece. To hold this macrame, I am using a wooden dowel. You can use any stick you can find, a popsicle stick, a pencil, a chopstick, whatever you have. Now let's get started with our macrame. First, I'm going to attach the base strings to the dowel using lark head knots. I'm just going to stick my string behind the dowel, then pass the end of the string through the loop that is created. And here is one lark head knot. The reference picture has 35 of these. So I'm going to repeat this process 34 more times. Just attaching these took me about half an hour. I quickly realized that this project was going to take longer than I expected. Altogether, it took about 2.5 skeins of black thread to finish my base. Then I did a row of double half hitch knots. Now this was a new knot to me and I had to watch a tutorial to get it right. I learned how to do it from Eleni Aman's video, which I'm linking below if you want to learn as well. I thought I could just do a row of forward knots all across to create this border, but I wanted to be more authentic to the reference picture, so I decided to do it properly and learn how to do this new knot. Then it was time to do some square knots. If you see the reference picture, the border framing the macrame is just a collection of square knots that are knotted in a grid fashion. I did like the picture shows and skipped the first string. Then I made a square knot using the next 4 strings. Doing this throughout the whole row, that gave me 17 square knots in this row. In the next row, we're going to make that grid formation by skipping the first 3 strings, just like in the picture. Then combining the strings from the 2 square knots above to make our square knot. So altogether, this row is going to only have 16 square knots, 1 less than the previous row. And for the last row, I'm doing the same as the first row, 17 square knots with the same strings used for the first row. You can kind of see the grid take form. This is when I start to regret the black bass strings because it does make it harder to see, especially on camera. But I used what I had and I think it is good practice for when I want to make a big macrame with macrame cord. I ended the border with another row of double half hitch knots. And now it was time for some colors. I tried to match my colors as close as possible to the reference picture with what I have, mostly because I have no taste when it comes to choosing colors myself. In the reference picture, there are 5 colors used. I'm going to start with the blue. We've got some spiral square knots going on, so that's what I'm going to do as well on both sides. The spiral square knot goes on top of 3 of our bass strings. So I gathered 3 and started knotting on top of them. At the end of the spiral, I had to do another new knot for me, a gathering knot. Now this was another knot that I had to learn from Eleni Aman's video. And oh boy, it was so tough to get it right the first time. It took me quite a few tries, and on my first knot, it still didn't turn out perfect. I almost gave up and decided to do something simple like forward-backward knots, but I stuck to it. But in my second spiral, I did manage to do it a bit better. The idea is to take some thread, make a loop, then twist the end around the loop that you have just created with the strings at the back as well. When you put the string end through the loop and pull on both ends of that string, you can hide the knot in those spiral loops that you made, making a nice and neat ending for your column. The macrame piece alternates between spiral square knots and regular square knots. So the next column was regular square knots. Another thing that we can notice in the picture is that the height of the knots changes as you go from column to column, from high to medium to low and then back to high. So I started my knot a little bit lower on this column, and then I repeated on the other side. I kept knotting for the rest of the columns, alternating between square knots and spiral knots and adjusting the height. I also switched colors as well to match the reference picture. Each one of these columns took me about 10 minutes to complete. So all together, minus the center column, it took about 3 hours and a half to complete all of them. And then I got to the center. This one is a little bit unique because it stretches from border to border. It's the longest column and it's kind of the focal point of the macrame piece. And it also marks the end of our macrame, almost. And by this point, I got so good at making those gathering knots that I had to show you my last gathering knot that I did. And I was gonna give up on making these, so it just shows that it comes with practice. Now we had to finish the macrame by repeating the same steps we did initially in the beginning for the border. I started off with my border by taping my macrame at the end to act as a guide for my double half hitch knots. That was a good idea for me to do. Initially, I tried to do it without the tape and I just could not keep a steady hand. It was not going in a straight line. And then I don't know why, halfway through, I thought that I didn't need the tape anymore, and it was also kind of to make sure that I was seeing exactly which bass string I was picking up. It was kind of hard to do that, to know which one I was picking up with the tape. So I took off the tape, which was probably my biggest regret. That made the border look a little wonky, and I wish I had taken my time more and been a little bit more patient with ending my border. But at this point, I was just so excited to finish the macrame, which ended up making it look less perfect than it could have been. So that was a tough lesson to learn, unfortunately. After the border was done, I gave the macrame a trim, and it was done. There are some clear differences in how clear the knots look from the original reference picture, because I was using a different material. But for the material used, I am pretty happy with how it turned. I need to brush out the ends a little bit more to have the tassels look a little bit more neat and line up more neatly. How do you think I did? It's pretty close to the original, eh? If you like this style of video, let me know by leaving a like or a comment. I would love to make more videos like this if it was fun for you to watch. And as always, thank you for watching.